shogun, blue-eyed samurai, magical battle, and finally, a new Assassin's Creed. Japanese history and culture has become the top trend of 2024. In the next couple of minutes, we'll talk about one of this year's most talked about historical characters. In recent days, no historical figure has caused as much controversy as Yasuke, a simple black guy who lived an incredibly colorful life in the 15th century, moving from Africa to Japan, taking part in Oda Nobunaga's wars and even witnessing his harakiri. And quite unexpectedly, Yasuke became the most discussed person on the internet in 2024 because the corporation Ubisoft decided to release a game about samurai where he acts as the main character. A war of edits immediately broke out on Wikipedia and the community was divided. For some, Yasuke is a slave who worked for the pleasure of the Japanese, and now, thanks to fakes on Wikipedia, is elevated to the rank of hero. For others, Yasuke is the first and only African samurai, a hero and a worthy character for the game. But who was Yasuke really? First, let's familiarize ourselves with the sources. We looked at Thomas Locklear's book, which is considered the starting point by proponents of the hypothesis of the first African samurai, as well as counter-arguments from social media that reference serious scholarly works. These include Shinkoki, a modern biography of Oda Nobunaga, and the records of the Portuguese who brought Yasuke to Japan. In the next couple minutes, we'll tell you who Yasuke really was. But before we get started, we'd like to make a few things clear. The samurai Minamoto no Tametomo was so accurate that he could shoot his enemies in the kneecaps from great distances. Samurai Ashikaga Yoshiteru was the best swordsman of his time and broke 12 swords before he could be defeated. The Ronin Miyamoto Musashi is a classic example of a mercenary samurai who lives by the sword. He is the one who is intentionally associated with the word samurai in Japan. And all of this is to say that the history of the land of the rising sun is full of legendary samurai, about whom thousands of anime and tens of thousands of manga have already been filmed and who look like a much more logical option for the role of the protagonist. Many people believe that if you were to make a game that claims to be connected to the history of Japan, it would be more logical to choose one of the classic samurai about whose life everything is known. This point of view certainly makes sense. So in the comments, please don't stir up pointless conflict and remember that Ubisoft is a commercial studio that targeted Yasuke to generate more discussion on the internet. It worked out fine, but that's already content for gaming channels. Our channel is historical, and we're going to talk about Yasuke in the language of dry facts. To begin with, Yasuke was born sometime in the 30s of the 15th century, the era of the great geographical discoveries. This era is usually associated with the slave trade to North America, but this is incorrect. First, the vast majority of slaves were not taken to North America, but to South America. Second, the main slave traders were Portugal, not Britain, and slaves were taken closer to their South American colonies. The third mistake is to assume that slaves only sailed to both Americas. The Indian Ocean slave trade was also thriving. Slaves were taken to northern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and even India. In fact, all indications are that Yasuke learned it on his own skin. He was probably from Mozambique or another Portuguese colony in East Africa, because Yasuke was not the first African in Japan. They all came into the country in those days, plus or minus a similar way, came through Portuguese traders. Portugal traded with the land of the rising sun during the 15th century as part of the so-called trade with the southern barbarians to Europe. Tons of jewels were sent in this way, and to Japan, tobacco, firearms, religion, and of course in limited quantities, slaves. And the last two categories often went side by side. Japan was eager to spread its religion, and the Jesuits, a Catholic order run directly by the Pope, were accompanied by guards. That's how Yasuke came to Japan. Here the versions differ, but only in terms of the status of the African. Someone says that he was a direct slave guard of the Jesuits. Someone uses a softer word, servant. But in reality, neither of them are right, because all foreigners were considered slaves on the territory of Japan. The East is a delicate matter, and Japanese feudal lords throughout history treated foreigners in a specific way. The Chinese rite of Kutu, when any newcomer had to swear an oath to the emperor, was a problem for diplomats. Opinions are generally divided. Thomas Locklear, in his book on Yasuke, notes that he was no longer a slave by the time he arrived in Japan. The argument is that Yasuke was already a skilled warrior and a very valuable guard, and that there is no mention of Yasuke's slavery anywhere in the sources. The counter-argument is also absent in the sources, but this is precisely what the sources hint, that Yasuke was most likely a slave, because in the 15th century a dark-skinned guard of a white master was by default more likely to be a slave than not. So we think Locklear is dodging the facts a bit in a convenient direction. especially since the arrival of other Africans in Japan as slaves is well documented, and the work of a guard in the 15th century was also common. In Morocco, even a special black guard would appear a little later, which in fact consisted of slaves but was considered elite. Then the most interesting thing, Yasuke, as part of his Jesuit delegation, met with the legendary Oda Nobunaga. Japan at that time was very turbulent. It was the so-called Sengoku period, also called the period of warring provinces. From the 15th to the beginning of the 17th century, Japan was one big royal battlefield of feudal lords. Officially, the end of fragmentation is considered the establishment of Tokugawa power in 1603 and the unification of the country. But many historians call the unifier of Japan just Oda Nobunaga, who played a decisive role in this process. The samurai gave his whole life to the question of the territorial integrity of the country. He not only conquered rebellious kingdoms, but also introduced literate reforms and even advocated free trade with foreigners. Nobunaga's hallmark was his disregard for age-old traditions. Samurai often took people into the army for talent. Actually, this argument is used by those who call Yasuke a samurai. Yasuke met Oda Nobunaga in 1581 and, for reasons unknown, passed from the Jesuits to him. This is the second point of division, where some believe that Yasuke was hired into the service of the samurai, and opponents argue that there was the most common resale of a slave who was a gimmick and raised the spirits of Nobunaga. It is impossible to find the truth here objectively, because all arguments are based on assumptions. But in fact, it does not matter, because further on, the Jesuits themselves wrote in their chronicles that Yasuke received from Oda Nobunaga the position of Kosho, and later that Yasuke was given a sword and a fighter's scholarship. No other definitions are used in relation to Yasuke. He is not explicitly called a samurai, nor is he called a slave. Everything falls into place here, for Kosho is a vague term for a lord's servant. It could have been a secretary, a mistress, or a guard. The fact that Yasuke was given a fighter's scholarship hints that he hardly changed his role and became something like a squire or guard for Nobunaga. This again fits with the role in which Yasuke came to Japan in the first place. Actually, on the basis of exactly two of these facts, some record Yasuke as a samurai, while others argue that he was a slave who performed all the same functions as the samurai. After all, samurai were also to some extent slaves of their master. The positions of the opposing sides do not contradict each other in any way. Yasuke could easily have been a slave performing all the same functions as the samurai, and on the other hand, he did not necessarily have to be a samurai in order to be by Nobunaga's side at the time of his death. It is only a matter of wording, which for people of the past had no meaning at all. This is perhaps the main point. We often call people of the past by terms that are interesting only to us, and the past was often populated by rich men and noble warriors who could humiliate and live a miserable existence. The label we put on a historical figure in no way cancels out who they were or were not. Yasuke definitely lived. But whether he was a samurai or not didn't really determine his life. The fact that they made him the protagonist of the game is as controversial as possible and obviously aimed at free publicity. The history of Japan is full of legendary samurai whose personalities and exploits are clearly known. Whether you will buy the game or refrain, let us know in the comments. And that's all for now. See you again, friends.